Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our backyard. In today's video, I'd like to talk to you about inviting pollinators, butterflies, native bees, etc., hummingbirds, and birds into our backyard. So my name is Crystal, and I garden along the southeast Texas Gulf Coast south of Houston, and I'm in Zone 9B. And the reason I garden is really to attract butterflies, hummingbirds, birds into my garden. And I started out really small, and I've just been adding along the way. I've got a cardinal, oops, just flew off, at one of my bird feeding stations. But I started out by inviting butterflies into my yard. And if you're thinking on adding flowers or wanting spaces that will invite butterflies into your yard, I highly recommend getting some type of a field guide. This happens to be a laminated guide, really easy to use, and it's specific to my area. It's butterflies of southeast Texas and the upper Texas coast. And so these are the common species that I would find in my yard. For instance, let's look at the pipevine swallowtail. It shows what the butterfly looks like, what the caterpillar looks like, how big it is, what its wingspan is, when you expect to see it in your area, and what the host plants are. And the host plant is particularly important if you want to invite these butterflies into your yard, because that's what the caterpillars feed on. So butterflies will come into your yard to feed on your nectar plants. And salvia is a good nectar plant. Porterweed is a great nectar plant, because the adult butterflies need to eat. But the next important thing is to have host plants. And so I would recommend starting out small and adding one host plant to your garden. This happens to be a host plant for the Gulf fritillary butterfly. And the Gulf fritillary butterfly is a nice, good-sized orange and black butterfly. And so I would observe these butterflies in my yard looking and feeding on the nectar plants. And then I would look and see, okay, what do I need to add to get them to lay eggs in the yard? And so this guide has been particularly helpful because it helps you identify the butterflies in your area, but then it also gives you the hints to the host plants and what you could add. And I would recommend adding one host plant to your garden, and you'll be able to see what that does. Right now, I have two hummingbirds that are fighting, if you will, dueling for the flowers in my yard. I like to come out in the morning to observe their behaviors. So a lot of people will start out by adding really wonderful nectar plants. And don't get me wrong, you need those because the butterflies will use them and they need them to live. But getting a host plant or two in your yard is really important because that will keep the butterflies and caterpillars in your yard virtually your whole season for when that is for your particular zone. You might ask, well, where do you get these? I just ordered this off of Amazon. Some areas have field guides for regions, others for states, and some for states that are combined. So not everything is the same, obviously, or the same authors, but you should be able to get a pretty easy to use field guide. Laminated is nice because it is protected. And I would recommend starting out doing that. That's going to give you the best success for your area. You can see over here I've got lots of flowers for the butterflies to come to for the nectar. This happens to be Tithonia, or the Mexican sunflower, and it is a butterfly favorite. It's like almost a perfect flower for the butterfly. It has a nice landing pad for them to land on, and then they just put their proboscis down into each one of these little flowers. That's what it consists of, and feed off of this nectar plant. This happens to be an annual that is grown from seed. So it's important to have a varied group of flowers in your yard for the different seasons. This is another favorite. This is Mexican flame vine that also gives butterflies very easy access to the nectar. But whatever you do, if you choose to add some butterfly nectar plants and or a host plant, I'd recommend starting small. This is Liatris. Butterflies love Liatris. Yarrow. Of course, Salvia. This is a huge hit, especially with the little butterflies, the Salvia nemorosa. This native is getting ready to bloom. Greg's mist flower. Queen butterflies love this. So it's important to look what's specific to your area. Down along the Southeast Texas Gulf Coast, we have a lot of different butterflies. And each area of the country or where you live makes a difference of what you're going to see. For us in the South, lantana is a sure bet, and mine is just starting to bloom. This is a sure bet for butterfly nectar plants. You might ask, why do you invite birds into your yard? Well, the big reason and the main reason is to keep pests under control. They go through my containers, they go through my garden beds, and they eat lots of bugs that I do want. And of course, they're going to get the occasional caterpillar. But adding the host plants and having enough of them is key to that not being a problem. And they keep really the pests that I don't want very much under control. And so in my garden, because I specifically garden for butterflies and hummingbirds and birds and pollinators, I don't use any pesticides. I don't use fungicides or herbicides. And I get plants that are successful for my area. This is a staple in my garden. It's a purple porterweed. It's unusual, but it is a nectar plant that refills the blooms with nectar all throughout the day. So I have pollinators on porterweed all throughout the day. They're not the most pretty blooms. They're certainly interesting in that they have a very long bloom spike, and they only bloom in a small section on the bloom spike each day. But because they refill with nectar, that isn't an issue. So when you find out what really works well in your garden, like salvia, and porterweed does double duty for both hummingbirds and butterflies, I started to plant more of it and create beds around it. I also venture into native plants. Native plants to your area is really important. This one happens to be a native plant in my area, which is the coral honeysuckle vine. Pollinators of all kinds love this flower, and then it creates berries, and I have berries all over, and they're just starting to ripen, and the berries sustain birds. It provides shelter. There's just so much life that happens, the birds and the bugs and the pollinators, when you do add native plants to your garden. And so natives are another important piece, native plants. And you don't have to start by ripping out what you have. Just add. Find a spot where you can add a native plant and see what that does. It really starts to transform your garden. This plant, or I should say vine, is so important because when the hummingbirds are migrating, especially mid-March, we're in southeast Texas, and they come very early through us so they can continue going north through the rest of the United States. And there's not a lot of flowers that are blooming, and this is one. And they are so appreciative. In fact, it's blooming heavily at that time. I did a video earlier in the middle of March about this coral honeysuckle, and I'm going to put that at the top so you can see at the top of this screen, so you can see that video. It was just gorgeous, and it will continue to flower like this throughout the year. Flowers here and there, and the hummingbirds visit every day. But it doesn't flower throughout the rest of the season like it does in that early spring flush. It's so beautiful. So for hummingbirds, it's all about the tubular shaped flowers. And salvia is a favorite. There we go. You can hear I've got the male hummingbird down. He's on the other side of this bed feeding. I'm going to walk around. He's probably going to fly away. Yep. He's watching me. So tubular shaped flowers, as I was mentioning, is just a huge hit with hummingbirds. And so if you have feeders out, that is wonderful. But if you bring in the flowers that they love, you can come down and eat. It's a male, ruby throat. It's really pretty. If you have the flowers that they love, it also brings in the bugs, and the bugs they feed on. And so tiny little gnats you'll see them feeding, and they catch them mid-flight. It's pretty fun. This plant is called a kufia, or a cigar plant. This is a favorite. You can see it's a tubular shaped flower. It's a favorite of hummingbirds. So what I did is I researched what were flowers in my area that hummingbirds liked. And of course, depending on where you live in the United States, it's different because you have different flowers. So some of these that I'm showing you are perennials for me. What I've showed you so far is a perennial. Farther up north in the United States, some of these are not perennials, they would be annuals. And so you might be interested in both annuals and perennials that are very successful in your particular area. So for hummingbirds, it's all about the nectar plants and the bugs and the water that you have in your yard. So in my yard, I had, golly, this is probably about the third year when I added a pretty easy mister. Hummingbirds love water, and they can't drink out of a regular bird bath. They're too big, and so this is very inexpensive, and I just added a mister to the yard, which they love flying through and cleaning their feathers. But I did not add this until much later in my journey of hummingbird and butterfly gardening. And then finally the birds. And the birds are an integral piece to my gardening puzzle. And you might think, well, golly, why do you have all this to feed birds? And I don't want to feed the squirrels because they are a pest in my yard. Lots of people love squirrels and love to feed the squirrels, and I think that's wonderful. I don't in my yard because they invite others, and I can have multiple squirrels in the yard that causes a lot of damage. And not only do they cause damage in the garden, they cause damage by eating the wood of our siding in our house, to chew down, if you will, to keep their front teeth in check, because their front teeth keep growing throughout their lifetime, and that's why they chew wood. And so squirrels down here are very destructive in the garden. And if you have squirrels in your attic, you know how destructive they are. So I have baffles on each one of my pole systems. And you can see they're out in the middle of nowhere, right? And the reason I have this is so animals like squirrels or rats or possums can't get to the bird seed. So really the only bird seed that I have on the ground is very minimal. And then, for instance, doves will come and eat birdseed off the ground. So then you might ask, well, what kind of birdseed do I use? Well, I will purchase birdseed that does not have shells. And the reason I do this is because I don't want messes down on the ground below my bird feeders. And so I will spend a little bit more money to get birdseed that's already shelled. And I do purchase this from a store, a local store called Wild Birds Unlimited. And they have both all different kinds of seed, but for me, I like to feed the songbirds in my yard. And what you see here happens to be what's called a dove guard. I have right now an issue with white-winged doves. Flocks coming in, I can get up to 40 white-winged doves. They're large doves. They're pretty, but they eat all the bird seed, and then my other birds don't have access to the food, and so I'm trying to deter them, and this has been doing a great job. So I will either have this or a cage around the bird seed, and the large birds can't get in to the cage. Of course, I have domes over, so I don't have an issue with water getting in. And then I put a suet up on my tree, and I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and it is a huge hit with so many different species of birds. It is called bark butter, and I put bark butter up here every day, and the birds come and visit it throughout the day. Right now I have to replenish it because babies are being born in the spring, and so the parents are coming to feed the babies, and this is high in protein, and so lots of birds will visit the bark butter. I do have suet feeders, so I have this also has bark butter in it. And again, my pole system has baffles. Each of the pole systems does. I have peanuts. Lots of birds love peanuts. And then over here, I'm going to go over here. I have a suet log, and my woodpeckers like to come and visit this and get, especially in the springtime for their babies, they get this suet, which is very nutritional for growing babies. And this is a ceramic log that looks like a log anyway. And it depends on the configuration that I use for my feeders. Really depends on the time of year. So in the fall, I will have this completely covered with hummingbird feeders, the nectar feeders, because of hummingbird migration. And I have lots of different spots that I put for these nectar feeders, or I'll put planters. And it just depends, like I said, on the time of the year. So I do have a couple of playlists. And I have playlists specifically for hummingbirds and the flowers that they enjoy in my yard. So I have videos that I've done over that. I have playlists for butterflies, nectar plants, host plants, and if you're considering putting in a butterfly garden. And I have those for birds. I do count during the winter time for Project Feeder Watch. I do count the birds in my yard in the winter to help with research. And so bringing in pollinators and birds and hummingbirds is really important to the ecosystem in my gardens. It brings that balance that I'm looking for, that healthy balance, healthy soils, healthy plants, healthy birds, healthy hummingbirds, healthy caterpillars. And healthy butterflies. This is my whole section of ground cover of white-veined Dutchman's pipevine that has been eaten to the ground, which is a wonderful sight for a butterfly gardener to see. And I did move the remaining caterpillars I'd mentioned in a post. I did move them to my woolly Dutchman's pipevine. It grows all the way up into my red tip tree. And this ground cover will come back very quickly. Last year I only had 2 plants, and they came back 4 or 5 times during the year. It's a wonderful plant that rebounds gorgeously in time for the next group of caterpillars to munch it down. And so I only had 2 plants last year, And I added to this when I was able to get more. So I had 10 plants in here, and the female butterflies just laid more eggs, which is wonderful. And every now and then, it's always fun to find where they make their chrysalises. And I saw this one. Under the siding of my house, and that is of the pipevine swallowtail. And then, as I come down, I find some on the brick. And this happens to be of eastern black swallowtail. Typically, I don't find the chrysalises, but sometimes they're easy to spot, especially if I've seen where they are crawling to. So if you're thinking about adding some of these spaces to your garden, I started relatively a short time ago, and I started small with only one small area, and I added butterfly nectar plants. And from there, I've expanded, and I'll take on a project. My husband and I will take on a project through the year. Typically, we'll do the project in the spring, but not always. One year, we took a morning in the weekend day throughout the summer and added drip irrigation to our yard. And it took us pretty much the whole summer. But that's been a game changer for me since we've added drip irrigation, because watering was getting to be fairly difficult. So start small, research, find out what's successful in your area. If you can, get a guide. And then watch how your garden transforms. My backyard was just trees and grass, and I love what it's turned into. It's so much joy to come out and see the life in the yard. So at the top of the screen, I'm going to add the playlists specifically for hummingbirds, butterflies, and birds. If you happen to be interested in those specific topics, I had to end on that note of the hummingbird feeding on the salvia. But I really hope, if you're considering putting in any type of addition to your garden, I wish you the best of luck, because you're absolutely going to love what it does. And I thank you for joining me today. I hope you have a wonderful day. And I hope to see you again soon.